Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today you're checking out a Magicka Dragonknight PvP build, and I'm calling this the Dreadnought. This is a heavy armor mag DK build, so we're obviously very tanky. But on top of that, I've built in a ton of burst damage, a really surprising damage combo that absolutely obliterates anybody in your path. And I think once you get that combo down, this build becomes very strong, and it's just very fun to play. So I think you're going to enjoy it. We'll start by going over the stats, the gear, the skills, champion points, and more coming up next. Alright, so let's jump into the stats first. A couple of disclaimers before we do that. I'm not completely min-maxed yet on this build. I need to get some better traits on my gear, for example, and finish my Undaunted passives. So you definitely can improve on the stats from here. But keep in mind also this build is set up around a proc set, which means the majority of our damage is actually going to come from procs as well, so that's just something to keep in mind. For max Magicka, we're looking at about 32,000 max health, 18,000, that'll go up to about 22, maybe 23k in PvP. Your max stamina is looking good at about 15k there. Magicka recovery will go up with our potion, so let's see that. About 1,600 there. Your spell damage, 2,600. That will get buffed by a Berserker, an infused Berserker glyph on the back bar, so that'll be over 3k when you're fully buffed. 32% spell crit for our resistances. Let's check that out. So 23,000 spell resist, 19,000 physical resist. For our attributes, 64 points into Magicka here. As far as race, I am a Dark Elf. I think Dark Elf has a few good bonuses as far as this particular setup. As far as the new DLC, you will be losing some of that fire damage, but what I do like is that you get spell damage and weapon damage. And if you didn't notice, we are using dual wield, so we are pulling some damage from our weapon damage pool, so that's going to be nice with the Dark Elf. You also get that nice bonus to Magicka and stamina, which is always great for PvP. So I do like Dark Elf on this build, but you could obviously go with Breton if you want some reduced cost. You could go with High Elf for some increased Magicka, kind of up to you on that. For the Mundus, I went with the Lover Mundus, and that's because we actually need to use both spell and physical penetration, which I will explain when we get to the sets, but I think Lover is definitely the best way to go on this particular setup. I am using Witch Mothers for the food. If you want, you could use the gold food here as well. That would be fine. And then for my potions, I'm just using a essence of spell power pots basically. We do have the spell crit bonus passively on the front bar, so I just need the spell damage buff for that one. So I think that covers the stats. Let's go ahead and jump into the gear next. So yes, this is a dual wield Magicka DK setup. That's something to keep in mind. I actually really like dual wield on the Magicka DK melee setup. It's really fun. And it's going to go really well with one of our other sets. But our first 5-piece set, the main set where we're getting most of our stats from, is going to be Shacklebreaker. And that's just because we get that kind of dual bonus here of Magicka and stamina. We get the weapon damage, get spell damage, Magicka recovery, stamina recovery, and then the 5-piece max stamina, max Magicka. So this is the perfect 5-piece, I think, for this kind of setup. I wouldn't call it a hybrid. It's not 100% a hybrid build, but it does have some hybrid elements. So Shacklebreaker, definitely the way to go for that. I am using this on my weapons. So we have dual daggers on the front bar. That's actually giving us a nice bonus weapon crit, which we don't have a weapon crit buff. Like, we're not using that weapon crit potion, for example. So I do like daggers. You could do dagger mace, you could do sword, dagger, whatever you want here. It's not a huge difference, but I think the traits are important. So main hand, I am using Nirnhone, and that's just for the extra damage. And then offhand, I am using Sharpened. And the reason why I'm using Sharpened is it's going to increase some of my proc damage that I'm using on this setup, as well as with the Mundus that we're going with, it kind of fits. So yes, Nirnhoned and Sharpened, very important traits there. For the main hand, I am using a Absorb Magicka enchantment, so just helping with our Magicka sustain a little bit. On the offhand, I have the Flame Damage enchant. That's for if we happen to proc Burning, we'll get some extra Magicka sustain from that. On the back bar, we have Shacklebreaker Resto with an Infused Weapon Damage enchant, the Infused Berserker enchant. The enchant is important, the weapon not so much. You can decide to do maybe Sword and Board here if you want. I'm actually not using any skills from the skill line. So you can kind of choose what you prefer here. Sword and Board will make you more tanky for sure. The Resto Staff is nice though, because if we do ever happen to run out of Magicka, which isn't very often, we can still pull off a nice Resto heavy attack and get lots of Magicka sustain that way. So it's kind of up to you what you prefer. Just play around with the build and see what you like best. And then rounding out my 5-piece here, I do have 3 pieces of jewelry. So the jewelry is pretty important here. We have 2 Arcane, then we have 1 Bloodthirsty. Now, if you saw the previous Magicka Dragonknight build, I had Bloodthirsty on that as well, and that's important, I think, especially in Battlegrounds. It's going to be very handy because we don't have a built-in execute on the Dragonknight setup, especially Magicka Dragonknight. So having this extra little burst of damage when you get your enemies under 25% health is going to be very, very helpful. So I would definitely recommend running at least 1 Bloodthirsty, maybe 2. And then the other would be the Arcane trait. And then I have Spell Damage, Magicka Recovery, and then Magicka Reduced Cost. For the next 5-piece set, this is where it starts to get interesting. We've got Curse of Doilamesh, very interesting heavy armor set. What this does is it gives you a good bit of max health, which is nice on the heavy armor setup and makes us very tanky. We do have the spell damage and weapon damage. Again, kind of a hybrid set, which goes with what we're building here. But then check out the 5-piece. When you use a fully charged heavy attack on a taunted monster, which doesn't apply to PvP, or an enemy who is stunned or immobilized, you deal 15k physical damage. So when I was talking earlier about that big burst combo, or you might have seen it in some of the intro clips, this is what really devastates a target in PvP. It does tons of damage. Obviously it'll be reduced a little bit, but you'll definitely hit about 5 to 6k on this proc, depending on your enemy's armor. Now, some things that we're doing to increase this, which we mentioned earlier, I've got the Sharpen trait on my offhand. I'm also using Lover Mundus, and you'll see one of my other sets is going to buff this as well. But one important note is that this is not buffed by any of your other stats. This is not buffed by weapon damage, it's not buffed by spell damage, or your max stats. The only way to buff this is either through a raw damage buff or through physical penetration. So that's kind of why the build looks the way it is. It's not very stat heavy, it's more built around supporting the damage from this set and making it hit as hard as possible. As far as making this set work, I think Dragonknight is probably the best class to use this set. Sorcerer used to be pretty good at using this set as well, but the changes to Rune Cage make it a little bit tougher, so I think Dragonknights get the most use out of this set. The way that we are going to proc this is through Fossilize, which we'll talk about in a minute, but Fossilize gives you a very, very high chance of proccing this every 7 seconds. So I'm just using this on the body. I've got 5 heavy pieces here, so we are doing 5 heavy, 2 light. So I've got my chest, I've got my waist, hands, legs, and feet. Obviously not the best traits here. Still need to work on that a little bit. What I would suggest is 5 in-pen and 2 well-fitted. If you can manage that, that would be ideal. Then I do have a mixture of glyphs here. I have mostly max Magicka, but I have some stamina and health as well, just trying to round out my stats as best as possible. And then for our third and final set, the monster set, I'm using 2 pieces of Slime Craw. This gives us spell crit, weapon crit. So spell crit applies to our spells. Weapon crit's going to apply to our dual wield attacks, which is very nice. Then we get that minor berserk buff at all times, increasing our damage by 8%. And like I mentioned earlier, this is one of the few sources, minor berserk, major berserk, that will buff the proc for Doilamesh. So that's the reason why I'm running this. It's going to make that hit harder. And then the spell crit and weapon crit's pretty nice too. So I have that 2 pieces of light, head and shoulders there. Let's check out the skills next, starting with our front bar. Dual wield. Got the classic burning embers. This does a lot of nice dot pressure as well as the healing. We do need this a lot for healing, so definitely apply this first. This should be the first attack that you think about landing, because it does give you a lot of nice pressure. And then you're guaranteed that heal too, either if your target dies or the effect wears off. You can also reapply this to get a quick burst heal, so that's something to think about. Next up, I'd say this is kind of a flex spot. I'm running Race Against Time here because I really like this for just general movement speed. You get the Major Expedition for 3 seconds. You get the Minor Force buff, which is nice. But then it also reduces the cost of sprint by 50%. And since we're a heavy armor setup, sprinting is just really brutal on some of those bigger battleground maps, for example. You'll definitely like having this skill. It almost makes it basically almost free for sprinting if you have this, as well as a couple of well-fitted armor pieces, so I really like this. If you don't have access to this skill or you just don't like it, you can obviously run chains here. The gap closer version of chains will be very helpful. That also gives you Major Expedition, so it's pretty similar. I just prefer this, again, for the reduced cost of sprint. It's also a little bit cheaper than chains. Chains can get pretty expensive, especially on a heavy armor build, so just a couple of options there. Next up, this is the key to making this build work. This is Fossilize. So this does a nice stun, which does actually pretty good damage, kind of helps our burst combo out. But the important thing about this is that it does a stun as well as an immobilize. So it almost doubles your chances of getting the Doilamesh set to proc. You can see here that it procs off an enemy who is stunned or immobilized. So either one of those situations will help to proc that set. And since this does both kind of in back-to-back order, it just makes it a lot easier to proc that set, I think. The other great thing about this is it cannot be it cannot be blocked or dodged, so it's really powerful, especially against stamina classes. The only thing to keep in mind is it does have a short range, so you'll need to sprint into range using either Race Against Time or chains before you get this off. But then this is what you start your burst combo with. Do Fossilize into that heavy attack. One of the reasons why I did dual wield here is you have one of the fastest heavy attacks in the game. Yeah, I just like this, and I think it does a bit more damage too, because you'll get 2 attacks in whenever you do that heavy attack. So I think it works out well. There's a nice synergy there. Next up is Flame Lash, and let me tell you how Flame Lash works on most Magicka DK builds. This will be your burst, right? But on this particular build, since we're using Doilamesh, the Flame Lash kind of comes in after. It's basically going to clean up your enemy if they're still alive at that point. So what Flame Lash does is it's going to proc off balance if your enemy is immobile or stunned, which they should be already from Fossilize. So basically what you can do, Fossilize, heavy attack. If that doesn't finish them off, a quick Flame Lash is going to proc that off balance. And then you can actually Flame Lash again to proc Power Lash. And what Power Lash does is it gives you a bigger damage, but it also gives you a nice burst heal. You can see 12k health over 2 seconds. This is one of the reasons why this build has really good survivability is the Power Lash heal. So definitely use this as much as you can. Even if you're just getting low health and you're not, able to kill an enemy, you can still proc Power Lash to get you a nice heal, get you back to full health, and then kind of regroup and get yourself back into the fight. Last up here is Inner Light. This is great just for the extra max Magicka. The extra spell critical is important for our spell abilities. And then also the revealing stealth or invisible enemies really handy to have against those Nightblades, right? So I do just like having this on the front bar, mostly for the passives. For our ultimate here, we're using Ferocious Leap. This is just a nice additional burst attack if we need it. It can also be used kind of as a gap closer. Think about closing the distance here. It has a nice range on it to get you into combat. And it does that nice AoE stun as well. Something you can try, which is just a ridiculous combo, is this does a stun effect, right? It has a pretty nasty stun, popping the enemy up into the air, so you can actually stun them with a leap right into a heavy attack, and you'll proc Doilamesh on top of the damage from your leap, so it's pretty brutal. So let's switch to the back bar Restoration Staff. Like I mentioned earlier, Restoration Staff is just my preference. You can choose to run Sword and Board if you prefer, because we're not really using any weapon-specific abilities here. First up, Obsidian Shard. This is another flex spot on the build. I like this because it's a ranged stun. You can see it's full range, 28 meters, which is really nice for group play if you have somebody attacking your group and you need to get them off as quickly as possible. This is a great option for that. It also gives you or your ally a nice heal, nice burst heal. So I like the utility of this. But you can run anything in this slot. You could actually run Rapid Regen, you could run Mutagen, you could run another DK skill. Let's say, for example, you could do Obsidian Shield, Igneous Weapons if you want to get more heavy attack damage. So kind of a flex spot there. Next up, though, Reflective Plate. This is definitely a must-have on the Magicka DK. This makes it really strong in PvP, especially in Battlegrounds, where you get that nice reflect for up to 6 seconds, and it really just negates a lot of incoming damage. So use this anytime you're fighting a ranged class, whether it's Magic Sorcerer, you know, bow, sniper, whatever it is. This will actually throw that damage back on them. You can then gap close, pull off your combo, and they're pretty much dead. So great skill to have. Next up, we've got Coag, and this is just our nice self-heal. We do have a heal on Obsidian Shard, obviously, but the difference here is that you need a target to heal off Obsidian Shard, whereas with Coag, you don't need a target. It's just a nice self-heal. So I do like having both options for a heal. This is kind of if I'm retreating, if I'm trying to reset the fight. I'm going to pop my wings first to make sure I reduce my incoming damage and then get some heals off with Coag. Next up, Cauterize. I like Cauterize because it gives me an extra heal every 5 seconds. You can do the damaging version of this if you prefer. Flames of Oblivion, you'll get some nice additional burst into your combo. You might think about that if you run with a healer, let's say, then you probably don't need the extra healing of Cauterize, and you can use the damage morph instead. But I choose to run the healing morph just because I kind of play random groups a lot and I'm never guaranteed a healer, so having the extra self-heal is really nice. You can see this back bar is all about defense and healing, so that's really a strong aspect of the Magicka DK is you have lots of strong defenses, lots of strong self-healing if you need it. Very good for survivability. And then last up, we got Volatile Armor. It's just our Major Resolve, Major Ward buff. For the ultimate here, you have lots of options. You can choose, if you are using a Resto Staff, you can use the Restoration Staff Ultimate. That will give you a lot of nice burst healing. Another option, really good option, would be Sigic Order. If you happen to have that skill line maxed out with the Undo Ultimate, you'll get a nice minor protection passive on your back bar, which is going to be really good for helping with your healing. Magma Shell is another option I like for group play. That's because you can kind of jump ahead into combat, limit your incoming damage to 3% of your max health, do some nice AoE damage, and it also gives your group a damage shield as well, so this is really nice for group combat and kind of utility and survivability. I like Magma Shell, but you can pick what you prefer here. And let's just take a quick look at champion points. So something to keep in mind is I did set this up for no CP in Battlegrounds. That's where this build is really going to shine and be very strong. But if you do want to take it into a CP campaign, I would recommend this type of setup. So 34 into Warlord, 33 Sprinter, 23 in Tenacity. You can even put more here if you want because we're doing lots of heavy attacks on the build. 75 into Arcanist, 27 Mooncalf. 40 into Shadow Ward, 37 into Tumbling, 32 Blessed, 37 Elfborn, 49 into Elemental Expert, 36 into Spell Erosion, 16 Physical Weapon Expert. Physical Weapon Expert because we're doing more damage with our dual wield than a staff really on the build. 72 Master Arms, 28 to Thaumaturge, 56 Ironclad, 65 into Resistant, 56 into Hardy, 43 Elemental Defender. You do have more elemental resistances on a DK, just passively, so that's something to keep in mind. 31 into Thick-Skinned, and then just 19 into Quick Recovery. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap up this build video for the Dreadnought Magicka DK. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, remember to smash that like button for me, or leave a comment in the comment section below. I will also do my best to answer any questions, so go ahead and leave those as well. Actually, I have a few more build videos that I'm working on, so those should be out soon, including the solo Stam Sork, so stay tuned for that. Make sure you turn notifications on so you get to see those as soon as they come out. And if you're not subscribed already, why the heck not? It's free, and it does really help me out, so I appreciate all of you guys very much. And until then, I will see you around in the next video. Thanks.